My beloved child. Do not move past these words too quickly. Something has been unfolding in the quiet, somewhere beyond what your eyes have been able to see, and what happened when your soulmate finally learned a piece of what you went through alone changed something inside them. They thought they understood your strength. They thought they knew why you sometimes became quiet, why certain memories seemed to pull you inward, why you learned to carry yourself as though you needed no one to rescue you. But they did not know the whole story. And when the truth reached them, when the scattered pieces finally formed a picture they could no longer ignore, their composure disappeared. What you are about to hear is not merely about their tears. It is about what those tears awakened, what they realized too late, and the decision beginning to form in their heart because of it. For so long, you carried chapters that almost no one knew how to read. People saw the version of you that survived. They saw you smile again. They saw you answer messages, continue with responsibilities, show kindness when your own heart was exhausted, and somehow keep walking forward. Because you kept functioning, many assumed the weight could not have been that heavy. They did not see the nights when silence became louder than any conversation. They did not see the moments when you wanted someone to notice without forcing you to explain. They did not see how many times you had to gather yourself privately before stepping back into the world and pretending everything was manageable. You became skilled at hiding storms behind ordinary expressions, and eventually even those closest to you stopped asking how much it had cost you to become this strong. But your soulmate began noticing something different. It started with details so small they could have been dismissed. A change in your expression when a certain subject came up. The way you could comfort other people with an understanding that seemed deeper than experience should have given you. The way you never laughed at another person's pain, even when everyone else treated it lightly. The way you seemed to recognize loneliness before someone admitted they were lonely. There was something in you that made them wonder where that compassion had been forged. They had admired it before. Now they began questioning its origin. And that question opened a door. They learned one thing first. Only one. It was not even the deepest part of your story, yet it was enough to make them sit differently, listen differently, and suddenly reconsider memories of you that had once seemed ordinary. Something you had said casually began making sense. A moment when you withdrew from a conversation suddenly carried another meaning. A boundary they once misunderstood no longer looked cold. It looked like wisdom earned through pain. And as they began connecting those details, they realized there had been an entire hidden history behind the person they thought they already understood. That realization disturbed them more than they expected. At first they tried to remain composed. They told themselves they were simply surprised. They asked another question, perhaps hoping the answer would make everything seem less serious. Instead, the answer revealed another layer. Then another detail surfaced. And suddenly they were no longer listening to a story about your past. They were imagining you inside it. They imagined you facing moments when you had nobody beside you who truly understood. They imagined you waiting for reassurance that never arrived. They imagined you learning how to calm your own heart because there was no one around who knew how. They pictured the younger, more vulnerable version of you trying to make sense of circumstances that demanded strength before you felt ready to be strong. and something inside them began breaking open. Because there is a difference between knowing that someone has suffered and suddenly seeing their suffering as though you had been standing nearby. Your soulmate crossed that line. The room around them seemed to disappear. Whatever had occupied their thoughts earlier no longer mattered. They became unusually quiet. Their mind went back through every interaction with you, searching for signs they had missed. They remembered moments when you needed patience and perhaps received confusion instead. They remembered times when you became distant and they wondered whether you cared, never realizing you might have been protecting a part of yourself that had already endured too much uncertainty. They remembered every occasion when your strength impressed them, and for the first time they understood that strength is sometimes the scar left behind when someone had no choice except to keep going. Then came the thought that shattered their composure. Who was there for them? The question arrived suddenly, but once it appeared, it would not leave. Who sat beside you when you could no longer pretend you were okay? Who listened when you were exhausted from carrying everything quietly? Who noticed the moments when your smile required effort? Who protected your heart while you were busy protecting everyone else's feelings? Who told you that you did not have to solve everything alone? And the possibility that the answer might have been, no one, became unbearable. That was when their breathing changed. That was when the tears came. Not graceful tears. Not the kind someone wipes away quickly before returning to normal. This emotion had been building underneath shock, compassion, regret, and something they had been afraid to name. They tried to hold themselves together because part of them felt they had no right to collapse over something you had actually survived. But emotion does not always ask permission. Their chest tightened. Their eyes filled. They looked away as though turning their face could somehow hide what was happening inside them. But there was nowhere to hide from what they had just understood. They were not only crying because you had suffered. They were crying because you had suffered while becoming the person they now cared about so deeply. And those are not the same thing. The truth made them look at you differently. Your kindness suddenly carried weight. Your patience became astonishing. Your ability to love after disappointment no longer seemed natural, it seemed courageous. They realized that some of the tenderness they received from you had been given by someone who knew exactly what the absence of tenderness felt like. Some of the reassurance you offered others came from someone who once needed reassurance and did not always receive it. Some of the loyalty you carried had survived situations that could easily have made your heart permanently suspicious. They whispered something then, barely loud enough to hear. How did they still become this kind? That question broke another wall inside them. Because they had expected your story to explain your guardedness. Instead, it explained your compassion. They had expected to discover why you sometimes pulled away. Instead, they discovered why you cared so carefully when you chose to stay. They had expected information. What they received was perspective. And perspective changes love. Until that moment, there were things about you your soulmate may have taken personally. Perhaps your silence confused them. Perhaps your hesitation made them wonder whether you trusted them. Perhaps your independence sometimes made them feel unnecessary. But suddenly they saw another possibility. Maybe your independence was never a rejection of closeness. Maybe it was simply the language of someone who had learned that depending completely on another person could be frightening. Maybe you were not trying to keep love away. Maybe you were waiting to see whether love could remain without demanding that you abandon yourself. That thought stayed with them. They began replaying conversations word for word. Tiny sentences returned with enormous meaning. Something you once joked about no longer seemed funny. Something you once brushed aside as nothing suddenly looked like a doorway you had quietly closed because you were not ready to explain what lived behind it. Your soulmate wondered how many times you had almost told them more. How many times you waited to see whether they would ask another question. How many times you wanted to be understood without turning your deepest wounds into an explanation for why you deserved patience. And then regret entered. Not because they caused everything you endured. They knew they could not rewrite years they were not part of. But regret does not always come from responsibility. Sometimes it comes from wishing you had understood sooner. They wished they had known why certain things mattered to you. They wished they had listened more carefully when your voice became quieter. They wished they had recognized that the strongest person in the room might still need someone to say, "You don't have to carry this one by yourself." And beneath that regret, another feeling began rising. Protectiveness. Not possessiveness. Not control. Something gentler and deeper. The desire to become a place where you would not have to perform strength every second. The desire to prove through consistency rather than dramatic promises that someone could know your history without using it against you. The desire to meet the parts of you that had learned to expect disappointment and show them, patiently, that the future did not have to repeat the past. But something complicated happened next. Your soulmate became angry. Not at you. At the thought that anyone could have watched you struggle and still made you feel alone. At the circumstances that taught you to minimize your own pain. At every moment when you might have wondered whether asking for help made you difficult. At every person who benefited from your kindness while failing to notice how exhausted you were becoming. They were angry at the invisible unfairness of it all. Yet even that anger quickly turned into grief, because they knew anger could not go backward and protect the version of you who needed protection then. So they asked another question. What do they need now? And heaven, in this story, grew very quiet around that question. Because this was the turning point. Until now, your soulmate had been thinking about your past. Now they were thinking about your future. They did not want to approach you with pity. Something inside them understood that pity would insult everything you had overcome. You did not need someone looking at you as though you were fragile. You needed someone capable of recognizing your strength without exploiting it. Someone who would not assume that because you can survive alone, you should always have to. That distinction changed the direction of their thoughts. They began considering what love would actually require from them. Patience. Consistency. Truth. The courage to remain present during uncomfortable conversations instead of disappearing when emotions became complicated. They began asking themselves whether they were ready to offer those things, not for a week, not while everything felt romantic and easy, but repeatedly. Because once they understood what you had endured, they could no longer pretend that careless affection would be enough. This is where the story becomes deeper, my child. Your soulmate's breakdown was not the revelation. It was the beginning of one. The real revelation came after the tears stopped. There was a stretch of silence when they sat alone with everything they had learned. Their face was tired. Their thoughts were racing. They could have distracted themselves. They could have opened their phone, changed the subject, walked into another room, or convinced themselves that your past was none of their concern. They did none of those things. Instead, they stayed there. And they made themselves remember. They remembered your laugh. They remembered the way your eyes sometimes revealed emotion before your words did. They remembered the moments when you encouraged them while carrying worries of your own. They remembered how you had offered warmth without demanding recognition for it. Then one particular memory surfaced. It was a moment between you that had seemed insignificant at the time. Perhaps you had said something about being accustomed to handling things yourself. Perhaps they had offered help and you replied, almost automatically, "I'm okay, I can manage." Perhaps you smiled when you said it. Back then, they believed you. Now those words haunted them. I can manage. Of course you could manage. You had been managing for years. But suddenly they wondered whether anyone had ever asked the more important question. Should you have had to? That thought sent another wave of emotion through them. They covered their face. Their shoulders shook. And for a moment, the person who had been trying so hard to understand your strength became overwhelmed by the price you had paid for it. But listen closely, because what happened after that is why this message has reached its most important turn. Your soulmate said your name. Slowly. Not as someone casually mentioning another person, but as though your name itself carried everything they had just learned. Then they made a promise. It was not spoken to you. You did not hear it. No message arrived on your phone. No dramatic confession appeared at your door. This promise happened privately, in a moment when no one was watching. And private promises can reveal more than public declarations. They said, in their own way, if I am given the chance to be close to them, I will not make them feel alone while standing beside me. Those words changed the atmosphere inside them. Because now this was no longer only emotion. It was intention. And intention is where stories begin moving. But before you imagine that everything became simple from there, understand this, your soulmate immediately became afraid of something. They realized that caring about you was no longer light-hearted. Knowing your story meant they could not approach your heart carelessly anymore. If they stepped closer, they would have to mean it. If they asked you to trust them, they would need to become trustworthy. If they told you they would stay, those words could not be decorations. And that frightened them. Not because they wanted to run. Because suddenly they understood the responsibility hidden inside being loved by someone who had already learned how painful inconsistency could be. They paced. They questioned themselves. What if I disappoint them? What if I say the wrong thing? What if they think I only see their pain now? What if they never tell me everything? Then came the question they feared most. What if they no longer need me? That question revealed something your soulmate had not admitted even to themselves. They had been confusing being needed with being loved. Your strength intimidated a part of them because you had proven you could survive without anyone coming to save you. But after learning what you went through, they finally understood something extraordinary. You were never asking for a savior. You were asking, perhaps without words, for someone who would choose to walk beside you. There is a tremendous difference. A savior arrives believing you are powerless. A true companion arrives knowing you are powerful and decides you should not have to use all that power alone. When this realization settled inside them, their fear changed shape. They stopped asking, "How can I become necessary?" and began asking, "How can I become safe?" That was the moment their heart truly shifted. Because safety is not built from grand speeches. It is built from patterns. From showing up when you said you would. From answering honestly. From respecting boundaries without punishing someone for having them. From learning the difference between silence that needs space and silence that quietly hopes someone will stay. Your soulmate began thinking about all of this. And then something unexpected happened. They learned another detail. This one had been hidden deeper. The first things they discovered had already brought them to tears, but this new information made them completely still. For several seconds, they did not respond. They simply stared ahead. Because this detail explained something about you they had never been able to understand. It explained why you sometimes questioned good things when they arrived. Why a peaceful moment could make you strangely cautious. Why promises might not impress you as easily as actions. Why you could deeply desire love and still become afraid when love moved too quickly. Suddenly, your soulmate saw the invisible connection between what happened then and how your heart protects itself now. And instead of judging you for it, they felt tenderness. They wished they could reach backward through time and tell you that you were going to make it. They wished they could stand beside the version of you who felt forgotten and say, "One day someone will learn what happened here, and they will finally understand why you became who you are." But they could not travel backward. So they decided to do the only thing available to them. They began planning what they would say when they finally spoke to you. At first, they imagined telling you everything they felt. They imagined admitting that learning your story had broken their heart. They imagined saying how much they admired you. But then they stopped. Something inside them warned that making your experience about their emotional reaction would be wrong. So they erased those imaginary speeches. They started again. This time, they imagined simply saying, "I understand more now." Then even that felt incomplete. Because they did not understand everything. And they knew pretending to understand what only you had lived through would be another kind of mistake. So they started again. "I don't know everything you carried. But I wish you hadn't had to carry so much of it alone." That was closer. And when those words formed inside them, they began crying again. Not because the sentence was dramatic. Because it was true. Yet there was still something they did not know. Something about your story had not reached them yet. And this missing piece mattered more than everything else. Someone who knew more had been hesitant to reveal it. They understood that this was your story, not theirs to expose carelessly. But your soulmate sensed there was another chapter. They could see it in the hesitation. They heard it in the unfinished sentence, the sudden pause, the way the conversation shifted just before something important could be said. Your soulmate noticed. "What aren't you telling me?" Silence. That silence changed everything. Because suddenly they knew. There was more. The tears they had shed were over only part of the truth. They looked at the person in front of them and asked again, softer this time. "What happened?" The answer did not come immediately. And in those few seconds, your soulmate's mind traveled through 100 possibilities. Then the person said something your soulmate was not prepared to hear. Not the whole truth. Only one sentence. One sentence about a moment when you had been at your lowest and almost nobody realized how deeply you were struggling. Your soulmate froze. Their eyes widened. "No," they whispered. They asked whether it was true. The person did not answer quickly enough. And somehow that hesitation was an answer. Your soulmate stood up. Everything they thought they understood about your past rearranged itself again. They walked toward the window, trying to breathe through the emotion rising in their chest. They could no longer imagine your pain as an abstract chapter that happened long ago. It felt close now. Almost present. And then they remembered something you had once told them. A sentence they had completely misunderstood at the time. You had said it quietly, perhaps months ago, perhaps during a conversation neither of you realized would matter later. Your soulmate had almost forgotten it. But now it returned with perfect clarity. And when they remembered exactly what you said after that sentence, their face changed. Because suddenly they realized you had tried to tell them. Not everything. But enough. You had opened the door slightly. And they had not recognized it. Their hand went to their mouth. "Oh my God," they whispered. Then another memory appeared. And another. Moments they had dismissed. Pauses they had ignored. Words they thought meant one thing but now meant something entirely different. Your soulmate began connecting them one by one until the truth formed a pattern they could no longer deny. But the final piece was still missing. And that final piece was about to come from someone they never expected. Their phone suddenly lit up. A message appeared. They looked down. They recognized the name immediately. For a moment, they refused to open it. Something in their chest told them that whatever waited inside that message would change the way they saw your story forever. The phone remained in their hand. Another message arrived. Then a third. Your soulmate stared at the screen as emotion rose again. Finally, they opened the conversation. The first line made them sit down. The second made their hands begin to tremble. But it was the third line that caused them to whisper your name again, because the person messaging them knew something about what you went through alone that your soulmate had never heard before. And attached beneath that third message was something else. Something from the past. Something connected directly to you. Your soulmate stared at it without opening it. They already knew that once they did, there would be no returning to the version of your story they believed 5 minutes earlier. Their finger hovered over the screen. Their heart pounded. And then they opened it.